7 principles of discernment. Respect, listening, speaking for ourselves, understanding other viewpoints, gratitude, forgiveness, and the 8th commandment. I do that because, for really Joy and Phyllis. We go over these every time we have a conversation, every time we have a session here at Emmanuel. But they've already memorized them, so they can give them to you. They don't have to.
So we have to.
So for you, it's you don't understand why they're not posted over here. Yeah, well, they are. I mean, we have them behind the whiteboard. Right. So I'm just thrilled to have Phyllis and Joy here. I've never seen the two of them in the same room, I don't think. Phyllis and I go way back. I got one of my first jobs after coming back from Africa, from Phyllis, with the Hein Fry Lecture Series. But Phyllis had extensive supervision over theological education in the ELCA, and then was the president of one of our, at that time, 8 seminaries in the ELCA in Berkeley, California. Since then, she has, what's that?
Oh, I was just wondering how many, two merged. Gotcha. I
was
wasn't like nobody died.
Nobody died. Well, sort of. And Joy has been running around doing not just venture capitalist stuff, and not just impact investment stuff, but she likes to meddle with all sorts of projects that she's going to give us a sense of. In fact, every time I read her bio, I go, oh my goodness, she's added to the things in the world, not just the United States, that she's messing with one way or the other, which is why we wanted them both here. You don't usually get a mother-daughter being able to speak to issues of church and faith and God's economy. And so with that, we're just delighted that you're here. Take it over.
Great.
Well, let's welcome them.
And now we'll take it over. I think we're good.
Right.
So so excited to be here, and it is fun for us to do this together. It's been about six years.
Yeah, I don't know.
So the day my mother retired from the seminary, I was visiting at the house and said, so I could use some help. And so she basically worked at Criterion for half time since she retired, which has been an amazing gift to figure out how to work together and do all kinds of stuff. But we've never,
I don't think we've
ever
done
done this together. It's usually a divide and conquer, so who knows? What I want to invite this morning, and for this sort of 24 hours or so that we're here, is we often think about the invitation being about the economy. We decided to step it a little bit to a somewhat different place, which is to invite you into a conversation about how to use your own power and how we can use the power of the church. Because at the core, so the world that I live in is a world that I've worked in for about 15 years. Before that, I was a high school teacher in Brooklyn, New York. But for the last 15 years, I've lived in a world where there's a set of people using their finances, using their imagination, thinking about ways to invest capital, to use financial systems to create social good. And as I was listening, we just caught the end of the sermon today, but there's a kind of sense of when we read the news reports in the morning, often what we look for, stock market's up or down, right? And we look for that measure of, is it up or down? But we don't necessarily look to listen for God in the economic systems, in the financial systems of the world. And at some level, so I've been working I founded a venture capital fund, that is true, about 10 years ago. I exited about 5 years ago, 6, 7, a while ago now. Because what I wanted to make sure that we were doing was not just moving money, right? So we had $6 million, we invested $6 million, yay. A bunch of companies got money to invest. As a result of that, those businesses grew. That's what investment firms do. But underneath all of that needed to be a conversation about power. Needed to be a conversation about who makes decisions, who's sitting at the table? How are we shifting relationships of power, not just moving money? And so in that, we've been, if you think broadly about social change and doing social good, we often measure things by quick metrics, right? How many people got out of poverty? How many houses got built? How many, how much charity did we give? Each one of those, underneath that, are a whole set of human relationships. In the housing development, there was a person who had an initial ask to say, hey, over here, we need more housing. They got together with the housing developer. The housing developer talked to a bank. The bankers talked to other bankers. In that whole single transaction that looks to us like a new building with housing in it, behind that was a whole set of relationships. And so what we talk about at Criterion is that it is not about just moving money or doing good with money, but about looking underneath and seeing what are the relationships and how is God calling us to be in a different kind of economic relationship. So just to be clear, and I'll hand this over to Phyllis in a second. So I run a think tank. So I've done, as Rick said, I've done a lot of different things in my career. But for Criterion is 18 years old now. It's the organization I founded. And our core mission as a think tank is to transform, to expand who sees themselves as able to use finance as a tool for social change. So how do we expand the set of folks who are using a theological imagination of finance, who are bringing their whole selves to a conversation of how to use finance as a tool for social change? And I'll talk a little bit about later about ways that specifically happens, and that's part of what we're going to focus on tonight and tomorrow morning. But why don't we turn it over, because one of the things that we started 8 years ago now is what you all have been participating in different ways, is this 1K churches. But I'll hand it over to you, Phyllis.
So, joy comes to this work of empowering people to use their power, and particularly their financial power, which they don't always even realize that they have, in order to do good in the world. She comes from the world of finance. What might make connections here? One of her first jobs moving in that area after high school, she was a consultant for Byron Tweeden, who was a member of this congregation.
True.
And I was a client of Byron Tweeden, so we're all like family. He helped us put together a system of theological education in the ELCA. So joy comes to this from the world of finance, and is a person of deep personal faith. I come to it from a lifetime of work in the church as a pastor, in theological education, as a seminary president, what have you. And so I'm learning finance from her and from people like you. But the power issue that is so central to the work we do together is gut stuff for me. This is the year we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the ordination of women in the ELCA. I don't know if that's been celebrated here yet, but it's a huge deal in this, huge deal in my life. So I was number 55 in the American Lutheran Church. But as a person becoming new to pastoral ministry, as a woman, never seeing anyone doing this before, I really had to think through the power issues involved. We don't talk about power much in the church. We talk about servanthood, we talk about loving, caring, sharing. But my experience as a new leader in the church with the authority of ordination made me really think those things. I got a PhD in the subject, actually, of power and servanthood and pastoral ministry. We need power to do things. Power is a neutral thing. It's the capacity to intentionally influence other people. And we really want to do that. Whoever preached today was doing that with all his heart. You know, we're all trying to do that. To make the world a better place takes power. But how we do that within the constraints, without falling into the pitfalls. The gospel lesson today was about Jesus' temptations, which is all about restraining power, not using it just for self-aggrandization. Jesus wasn't going to turn bread into stones because he was hungry, but he was perfectly happy to turn stones into bread, to multiply the loaves and fishes to feed thousands of people. So coming as a woman to ministry and being in positions of power made me have to think it through. So I wasn't becoming part of the problem, so I was able to call it when it was a problem for us to talk about more explicitly. So it's great to be working with my daughter at this point in life, talk about a change in power relations. I've been somebody, and now I'm a volunteer in my daughter's organization, and learning a ton. But part of the privilege of that, I have my own little area. I'm not talking to people about their investments. I'm the primary author, I'd say, of the 1K Church's materials, and I don't know how many of you participated in. One? How many of you even know what we're talking about when we say 1K churches? Okay, I've got my audience.
One person.
Okay. So, Criterion does far-flung things. If you come to our other sessions, you learn what's going on in Asia and Africa and whatever. And most of it is not church-related. But 1K Churches is the on-the-ground experience that we have created for congregations. Well, there aren't many like yours, let's face it, but for maybe 300 congregations across the country. And you've done it here. It's a 5-week Bible study connecting faith and finance, talking about it, thinking about it in your personal life. It leads you to make a loan, a microloan, $500 to $5,000 to a small business in your own community, not in Bangladesh, but developing a relationship with the business owner, a reciprocal relationship, and supporting them in all kinds of ways. And the impact of it, I guess, in terms of power, is people grow in the way Joy talked about, to claim their own by the action and reflection, by thinking about what God has in mind in terms of what the economy ought to be, the economy that God created and is active in. How do we make that more like God's economy again? By having a chance to think about that and act in the world by making this small loan, and even making up your own rules for how you make the loan. Well, we provide plenty of guidance to keep you reflecting back on your faith and not starting to be bankers, but think about what the relationship is. And you further a cause that you care about. If it's poverty, if it's veterans. If it's veterans, you look for a business to invest in that's hiring veterans. Or if whatever it is, you can use the power of your little pot of money to further a business that's multiplying the impact of what you want to see happen in the world. So it's an exercise of power done in a respectful, reciprocal kind of way. And you've done it in this church in an exemplary way. You are a star pupil, and you ought to all be celebrating it, whether you participated personally or not, because there will be more chances to participate. With the leadership of Rick Lees, who I happen to know, and I don't know who all else, you were able to put those 5 sessions into a one-day retreat, and you've done it twice. And you put together not just the power brokers, you put together a mix of people that was multicultural from both congregations and from youth and adults working together. And at the end of that one-day retreat, the youth and the adults each made a decision to make their own separate loan. So youth were empowered to start thinking about how they can use power for good in the world. And tonight, not everyone is able to be there, but there's going to be a banquet tonight focused on women. And 4 of the recipients of those loans that you've made in your community are going to be there and be honored. Now, what kind of crazy world is it where you honor loan recipients? But this is a way of turning those power dynamics on their heads and saying, these are business leaders in whom we're proud to have a relationship and investing and wishing them well.
Yeah, and just to build on that, sort of places where a story of where Criterion takes that same idea of what happens in local churches, and part of the idea here is to make a connection between what happens in local communities and how that can making a loan of $500 to $5,000 to a local community business is not going to transform systems of the economy by itself, but it equips a set of people who were in that conversation.
Yeah.
It's really a process of faith formation. It's not about the loan, it's about the transformation of the individuals who went through that Bible study and their ability to rethink their own relationships within God's economy. And so just a parallel example, to give you a flavor of some of Criterion's broader work, I was in Kenya 2 weeks ago with a group of grassroots women's organizations, all who work on gender-based violence in Kenya. And so it is, gender-based violence is an epidemic across the world. And in the agricultural, rural settings in which these women lead, it is particularly problematic. There's in Lake Victoria in Kenya, in order for women to participate in the fish trade system, to be able to catch, they're not the fishers, but even to trade the fish and take it to market. This is church, we're supposed to talk about hard stuff, right? In that, there is something called sex for fish, where women have to perform sexual favors with a single man to be able, so one man would have a relationship with up to 20 women to even participate in the system, right? So here's a set of women who are on the ground working with women who experience this kind of hardship. And we brought them together to talk about finance. Well, goodness, the woman who spoke at the beginning told a story of being asked to be on a broader representational board. I don't know, it was something, these women are leaders in their community. But she was really clear that she was on this advisory board as the African woman. And it became really clear to her a couple meetings in, she wasn't actually supposed to talk. Right? She was just supposed to be there and be the African woman that represented whatever that was, but not actually share her experience. And part of her struggle was she didn't know how to translate her experience, which she experienced day to day, into the language of a broader economic system. Because let's face it, finance as a system of power in this world is extraordinarily influential. It defines so much of what we think as possible. So here's a woman, amazing, fierce, smart, but didn't know the language of finance. So 2 days later, after talking through how finance, we love doing this, kind of breaking apart. We have a box of cards that are a bunch of toys about how to think about how finance works. At the end of these 2 days, this woman felt equipped to participate in what we have as a global initiative. So now imagine a woman working in rural Kenya on issues of sex for fish, who's now connected to Criterion has $750 billion between pension funds and others who have committed to say that they wish they were using wish that they were using their investments to address gender-based violence. So we've got this power of a bunch of pension funds, including some faith-based pension funds, including some congregations, including some individual people of faith, just saying, we want to address this issue. And so the broader system is, here's a woman on the ground who can now see herself as influencing $750 billion because it's her imagination that we need. It's the people who actually are on the ground, who are in situations, understanding the lived experience. Not just the folks on Wall Street who are running numbers and saying, I wonder, is this going to go up or down? But the folks who actually understand how life works. And those folks don't have a seat at the table. And so in the middle of all of this, that's $750 billion in a couple weeks later. So we never touch any money, we're a think tank, we just think about stuff, but we make these connections, right? And so we have a lot of connections in UNICEF, they fund a lot of our work. The work in East Africa was actually funded by George Soros's foundation, OSF, Open Society Foundation. But we have a long-term partnership with UNICEF, who has a partnership with OPIC, as do we, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. So now there's UNICEF and OPIC and these $750 billion of people using their power and influence connected to this woman in rural Kenya, right? And to me, the point of that is not how the $750 billion is meaningless. It is a show of power that is a performance, because people like that number. You all perked up, right? $750 billion, that's a lot of money. But what matters in that whole system is not just OPIC's machinations, not just UNICEF's generosity, but actually what matters is that woman's lived experience of how could we rethink how we finance agricultural supply chains in East Africa, that her voice now might matter. And so in that whole connection, the question is, what's the role of the church? Can we play more of a role, not from stepping back from systems of finance, but for stepping in? We have a massive infrastructure, right? The Lutheran Church has a massive infrastructure globally in which we could be facilitating those kinds of connections, because in the end, those kinds of connections is the point of the body of the church beyond our individual faith.
And we could do more right here. 1K Churches is meant to be kind of a taste to begin to have people feel more confident or get the idea that we can, with a little bit of money, we can make other things happen. But I hope at the end of these, I hope we're planting seeds so that the congregation and the leadership are thinking of more ambitious things you can do as a way of magnifying your impact for good.
So we got cut off a little bit for time because the service went, but we should probably fill in just again. We have done 2 micro lending retreats here. That's probably news to most of you, right? But we've done this twice, and we've given out in the last 3 years 6 loans, all below $1,500 because we were starting and we didn't, you don't know what you're doing, and so we experimented. We got the whole program from these 2 people. They wrote the program. They gave us
other people that
what
work
did
at
it
Criterion.
cost?
we have given out $6,000 of loans.
Oh, yes, but
Our
the
program
materials
is
are
Oh, free.
We're not selling materials.
Free.
We don't know, we're
Free.
building a movement.
And whenever we had issues or questions, we just called Phyllis and said, how do you do this, right? But all the legal issues, all the things that we needed to carry out these loans, really the hardest part, and Phyllis said this right up front, who do you know who needs a loan of $1,000 in their business to make it work? So that's pushed us, obviously, to go deeper into the neighborhood and say, who could you, because most of us would go to a bank, or we just go to a friend, or we go to our own expense accounts. And so it's teaching us how to reconnect with the community. Secondly, they're going to be presenting tonight. Unfortunately, tonight's event is sold out. So that's exciting. That's also disappointing. But they will be here tomorrow to give more detail. Monday in the manual from 10 to 11:30, where they can go more into not just the 1K. 1K stands for 1,000 churches. They're trying to do the same thing that we're doing here. But we'll have much more time then for questions and answers.
And on Monday, it really will be more of a deep dive into what are these leverage points where you can make change in finance. It'll be more practical to think about what beyond micro lending you might be able to do.
We're so thrilled that you're here because you're not only doing this locally, I know Phyllis, you did this in your own congregation, I believe, but also we can see what's going on nationally, how our program here fits in the United States and with the ELCA, but then global as well. And so let's thank them for being here.
Feel free to ask the questions if you want to come up and talk.
And we've got some,
So, Rick, we had more, I think you had other things.
for tomorrow.